What if an asteroid impact wasn't responsible for wiping out all the dinosaurs? Instead, what if it was a giant volcano? And not just any volcano, but the largest single-vent eruption in Earth's history. This super-eruption threw so much ash into the atmosphere that it caused an ice age. Humans were affected so badly that our brains actually shrunk, so bad that it may have been worse than the asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs. We call this the Toba Catastrophe. And while there are a lot of questions we can't answer, there are some pretty crazy details we know for sure. Hey there, welcome to my channel. Let's go back about 74,000 years ago. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had been living in Africa. Homo sapiens had yet to leave the continent. Neanderthals still lived in Europe, and Denisovans occupied parts of Asia. But something big was coming that would affect all of us equally. It didn't matter where you were on the planet. Life would never be the same again. But before we get into what happened, let's take a look at where it happened, because this was a very special place. This is the Indonesian island of Sumatra. And here is the lake at the center of the island called Lake Toba. This is where the monster lives. Now, this monster isn't real, but it did exist 74,000 years ago. In fact, it created this lake in the first place. I'm talking about a supervolcano. You know how volcanoes erupt and spew lava and ash and hot rocks called tephra, which, by the way, is Latin for rubble. Well, imagine a volcano that erupted way more stuff than normal. It ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of tephra. To put that in perspective, Mount Helens erupted 30 cubic kilometers of tephra. So the Toba eruption was about 90,000 times bigger. If that doesn't seem like enough, let me put it another way. When Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines in 1991, it was considered a massive eruption that covered entire villages in ash. Its total volume of ejected material was 6 cubic kilometers. So the Toba eruption was about 47,000 times larger. Needless to say, this eruption was huge. It was a 10 on the volcanic explosivity index, the highest possible rating on this scale. And when it comes to power, only 4 other eruptions come close. Krakatoa, which also took place on the Indonesian island of Java, although this eruption was about half the size of Toba. Then we have the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, also in Indonesia, which ejected about 3 times less material than Toba. The 1980 eruption of Mount Helens, which was about 100 times smaller, and finally the 79 AD eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which buried the Roman city of Pompeii, which was about 33 times smaller. I think you're getting the point. The Toba monster was really big. The eruption began when magma pushed up through the crust and formed a magma chamber beneath Lake Toba. Pressure built until it was released in the biggest explosion in human history. Ash shot 40 kilometers into the air and spread across the whole planet. But let's be honest, no one was too worried about the ash falling on them, because at the time, humans were living in Africa, far away from this mess. So why do we care so much now? It turns out that this eruption affected every single human alive at the time, all of us. Scientists believe the amount of ash blocked enough sunlight that it caused global cooling. This period of intense cold is called the Toba Ice Age. Humans were forced out of their home in Africa and into new regions they hadn't explored before. They had to adapt to survive. This meant that they had to learn how to make clothes and use new tools and hunt new animals. Basically, the Toba eruption forced humans to become more advanced, at least according to some scientists. Others, however, disagree and say that the evidence for this is weak. Either way, it's undeniable that this eruption changed the course of human history. Not only were humans forced to migrate and become more advanced, depending on who you talk to, but our brains were actually affected. Scientists recently discovered that humans from this time period had smaller brains than the generations before and after. This makes sense since humans were dealing with a disaster unlike anything we've ever seen before. But why would our brains shrink? Why don't they get bigger during hard times? Well, it turns out that brain size isn't entirely genetic. A lot of it depends on nutrition. During times of crisis, people tend to eat less, which means less food for the brain. and since the brain needs lots of calories, it shrinks in response. Our ancestors started eating more meat to get enough nutrients to keep their brains from shrinking even further. Some scientists say that this change in diet helped humans develop bigger brains, while others say it stunted our growth. Either way, the timing of this dietary shift and the subsequent brain shrinkage coincides with the Toba Catastrophe. There's also evidence that the Toba eruption may have contributed to the extinction of Neanderthals and Denisovans. Maybe the eruption gave modern humans an advantage over our cousins. Maybe they had better hunting techniques or made better clothes. Whatever it was, the timing of these extinctions coincides with the Toba eruption. But again, we don't know for sure if it was the main cause. So why aren't we all dead? Why did the Toba eruption only force migrations and changes in our lifestyle instead of killing us all? It turns out that the eruption actually happened in two stages. First, a smaller eruption sent 2,800 cubic kilometers of debris into the sky, which was definitely large enough to block sunlight and cause an ice age. But then, there was a second eruption about 1,000 years later that sent another 1,700 cubic kilometers into the sky. But by that time, most of the damage had already been done. What's crazy is that this second eruption was about twice the size of the first one, but its effects were much smaller. And that's because the first eruption hit the atmosphere like a bomb, but by the time the second one happened, the atmosphere was still recovering. So the second eruption was able to mix with the water vapor in the lower atmosphere and form clouds. These clouds reflected sunlight away from the planet and caused even more cooling. If that wasn't bad enough, sulfur compounds from both eruptions mixed with water vapor and formed sulfuric acid. This lowered the pH of the atmosphere and made it even more effective at blocking sunlight. Basically, this event was the perfect storm. The combination of two eruptions caused extreme climate change that led to the Toba Catastrophe. But wait, there's more. Some scientists argue that there was actually a third eruption. Remember that I told you the first eruption was about 2,800 cubic kilometers. Well, some say that number should be 5,200 cubic kilometers. If that's true, then the first eruption was almost twice the size of the second one and would have been even more devastating. Unfortunately, we don't have proof of a third eruption, but if it did happen, then maybe it was so big that it was split into two separate events. After all, we're talking about an eruption that happened 74,000 years ago, and we're only now discovering new information about it. In fact, researchers are still arguing about whether the Toba eruption even happened at all. Some say it was just a really big volcanic event, not a single super-eruption. Regardless, there's no denying that something huge happened in Indonesia 74,000 years ago. Something that changed the course of history, whether it was a single super-eruption or multiple large eruptions. We don't know exactly what happened, but it's exciting to consider how close we came to being wiped out. Maybe our species would have died along with the Neanderthals and Denisovans. Maybe the humans that survived would have been so genetically similar to chimps that they wouldn't have been smart enough to build cities or travel to the moon. Or maybe they would have died out when the next big eruption happened. Science is always evolving, and new discoveries about the Toba Catastrophe will continue to be made. I hope I've earned your subscription, and if I have, check out this video next.